In December 1944, the Ardennes at dawn carried a uniform, narrowing whiteness that pressed down on everything beneath it. Snow fog clung to the roads in drifting sheets, softening the outlines of the forest, while severing field telephone lines in faint irregular pulses. Within a single day, gaps had been torn into multiple sectors of the front, and the Elsenborn Ridge, little more than a long rise of frozen soil, was abruptly forced into serving as a critical hinge. If American units yielded here, the Germans would seize the road network behind it, turning confusion into collapse. Before the situation was truly understood, orders pushed thin infantry elements toward the ridge, substituting bodies for reserves that had not yet arrived. Before sunrise, Captain John Carver received one of those orders inside a jeep whose engine struggled against the cold. The message was stripped down to its essentials. Company I would advance to the northeastern tree line of the ridge and delay the enemy for 20 minutes. No armor, no artillery, no guaranteed line of withdrawal. Though the staff never called it a death mission, every accompanying report implied the same expectation: that a company sent forward at that moment would not return in its original shape. Carver read the order once, folded it, and placed it into a breast pocket. He spoke to his platoon leaders in a tone so level it might have been discussing a schedule, not a battlefield assignment. His resistance to the idea of acceptable losses had always placed him at odds with how operations were typically planned. Years earlier, a training accident had taken a student under his supervision, and since that moment he refused to reduce any man to a figure on a staff table. War sharpened that instinct until it resembled a boundary he no longer allowed anyone to cross. As Company Y moved toward the ridge, the snow underfoot cracked in a soft, brittle rhythm that thinned across the frosted ground. The sky remained dim. Tree shadows merged with sheets of fog, turning the slope into an indistinct plain where distances became unreliable. Carver made frequent, precise adjustments to the spacing of the formation, unwilling to allow even minor gaps to emerge. His eyes moved over the slope's angle, the spacing of trunks, and the patches where the snow concealed softer soil. If the company deployed according to doctrine, their line would stretch across the forward edge of the ridge and become the first target for concentrated fire. The machine gun teams, placed on typical high ground, would have clear fields of view, but no concealment. Terrain and doctrine clashed, and the terrain would not yield. Here the true conflict of the mission took shape. To delay the advance, the company needed to form a barrier on the enemy's axis. To preserve the men, that barrier could not resemble any standard line. The two aims resisted one another, and Carver knew he had to choose. From the lower ground came a steady, muted vibration, like a distant engine filtered through frozen earth. It was the march of grenadier companies crossing hard surfaces. Reconnaissance indicated that 2 companies of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division were already in the eastern approach, advancing faster than expected. If Company Y set up in the usual pattern, the German assault would tear through them in the first contact. The assignment would expire in minutes, and the company with it. Carver stepped onto a bare rock at the ridge's forward edge and studied the tree line below, the angled branches, the road crossing, the broken surface of the slope. His decision took shape almost instantly. He would rebuild the defense from its foundations, replacing a linear front with a staggered formation, aligning the machine guns not on the upper ground, but behind low folds of earth, placing riflemen in layered echelons that could reframe the slope into zones. The ridge, in his mind, no longer resembled a battlefield diagram. It looked like a field marked into lanes, each one a point from which momentum could shift. Snow fog became an ally in the same way a sudden change in weather might favor one team over another. His goal was simple and absolute, a defensive shape that allowed every man to walk back from it. He relayed the new orders with the same unbroken calm. The soldiers moved to their positions. Any doubts they carried remained unspoken. The sound of German engines rising through the fog made conversation pointless. The first layer of the defense was still forming when the vibration from below deepened. Snow fog drifted between the trees, stretching and contracting like a thin membrane. Carver checked each squad's placement one final time, using only seconds at each stop. In the quiet, the slope felt suspended, waiting for a blow that had not yet landed. The 20 minutes assigned to them had not formally begun, but each breath seemed to count against the total. The battle would begin in a moment. By the time Carver's men reached the northeastern rise of the ridge, the morning had settled into a flat, colorless light. Snow fog coiled among the trunks in slow, uneven strokes, tearing open in small rents and closing again without pattern. Carver stepped over a tangle of frozen roots to survey the ground ahead. In a brief interval, he formed the parameters he needed. The slope dropped away in broken terraces, concealed beneath snow that disguised its irregularities. Hard patches alternated with softer pockets where the weight of a soldier could sink enough to disrupt aim or footing. Machine guns set on those soft spots would shift at the wrong moment. Nothing in front of him aligned with a conventional defense. The ridge's apparent openness was deceptive. Beneath the snow and fog lay a series of features that would shape the fight. The tree line split into two bands, an inner line of upright trunks spaced tightly, and an outer line where frozen soil had toppled numerous trees to form a scattered belt of cover. Viewed from the crest, the logs formed no regular pattern. They lay angled in conflicting directions, promising to break the cohesion of any advancing formation. At the same time, those irregular angles could serve as concealment for the riflemen who would use them. Carver divided the slope in his mind without relying on any map, as if marking lanes on a field, tiers, folds, and arcs of movement rather than fixed textbook positions. Doctrine might have preferred high ground for machine guns, but Doctrine had not walked this terrain. Carver placed the guns low, behind the natural breaks in the slope. Their fields of fire were narrower but unpredictable, hidden by the uneven surface and obscured further by the snow fog. From these folds, fire could strike upward and cut across the approach in ways the enemy would struggle to map. He ordered the gunners to shift their weapons laterally in short bursts during the engagement. The movements would be small but decisive, designed to break any attempt to pinpoint their location. The riflemen he arranged in 3 staggered echelons. The spacing between them was calculated not for breadth, but for depth. Instead of forming a single band of fire, the company became a layered structure in which each element could support the others without presenting a unified front. Carver instructed them to use trunks, logs, and snowbanks as cover, not because they were stronger than trenches, but because digging into frozen ground would take time and advertise their presence. A visible trench line would tell the enemy where to focus their advance. A line that looked unprepared, that blended into the forest's own disorder, would cloud any assessment made under pressure. The soldiers moved quietly, adjusting positions by gesture and brief touches. The air carried only the faint sound of snow compressing beneath their boots. No one complained about the unorthodox layout. They were too aware of the growing noise from below, the rising intensity of the footfalls, and the harsh scrape of branches displaced by men moving uphill. The tension inside the company did not erupt into speech. It thickened instead into a shared attentiveness that pulled every motion tight. The wind shifted again, and light drained from the slope as the cloud cover thickened. Snow fog gathered in shallow waves, muting sound and constricting visibility. Carver recognized the advantage in this. Any shots fired would bounce unpredictably between trees and snow-covered ground, misleading an enemy who depended on sound to trace firing points. In these conditions, the first volley could distort the enemy's understanding of how many rifles and machine guns confronted them, but this would only work if no one fired early. Carver walked the line, repeating the same instruction with his presence rather than words. Soldiers adjusted the angle of their rifles, drew in their breaths, and waited. He looked to the positions placed near the fallen logs, checking that no profile broke the contour of the ground. He knew the smallest exposure, a helmet crest above a ridge or a muzzle glint through fog, could prompt a premature shot and bring the entire structure of the defense crashing down. From below came a sharper series of sounds, metal striking against gear, a heavier tread as the advance thickened. Then the noises settled into a single pattern, several dozen men moving with purpose through broken terrain. The Volksgrenadiers' advance was not cautious probing. They aimed to cross the ridge in a forward push, using momentum as both shield and force. Their training emphasized closing distance quickly. If they were allowed to do so, they would breach the defense before Carver's layout could work. Company Y compressed itself into silence. Rifle stocks pressed against shoulders. Gloves tightened around cold metal. Breaths shortened. The snow fog pulsed with each shift of wind, showing and hiding the slope in alternating strokes. Carver remained at the forward tier, eyes moving from trunk to trunk, registering each change in the enemy's movement. The Germans advanced into the outer band of fallen logs. Through the fog, their outlines wavered, too indistinct for clean aim, but clear enough for Carver to judge distance. Their formation shifted as the ground forced them to step over obstacles, creating small gaps between groups. A disciplined unit might have compensated by slowing, but their speed did not change. They intended to compress the distance with a single forward motion. To Carver, the moment felt like an arrow arcing toward its release. Everything he had constructed on the slope depended on catching the enemy inside a narrow window. Too far, and the shots would disperse. Too close, and the grenadiers would press into the tiers and break the line. He listened to the changes in their footfalls, the pace and density of sound, the way the voices behind them grew more muffled. The fog swallowed the details of their shapes, but it revealed their rhythm. He knew from the cadence alone that they were entering the zone where all his layers of fire converged. A gust of wind pressed harder against the slope. The snow fog thickened, then curled inward, tightening the space in front of the company. Visibility shrank to a narrow corridor in which the Germans moved like shadows without edges. Carver verified the machine gun positions with a brief glance. Low silhouettes, steady barrels, no motion out of place. He measured the rhythm of footfalls and judged it precise enough to act. He raised his hand. The men around him exhaled once, but no one moved. He lowered his hand in a clean, unbroken motion, and the slope erupted. The first bursts from the machine guns tore through the snow fog with a violence that felt disproportionate to the silence that had preceded it. From their low positions, the guns spat short, precise streams that shredded bark and sent splinters scattering across the slope. Snow lifted in thin curtains under the pressure of each shot, drifting sideways before settling back into the earth. Within seconds, the narrow corridor through which the Germans advanced filled with fragments of sound, sharp cracks, ricochets, and the blunt thud of rounds striking frozen wood. Rifle fire followed. It came not as a single unified roar, but as a sequence, each echelon firing in its own measure. The 3 layers of rifles did not create a wall of noise. Instead, they formed a shifting lattice through which echoes folded and recombined. The ground absorbed certain frequencies, dulling them, while the trees threw others back in strange, dislocated angles. To the men moving uphill, the ridge seemed to be firing from multiple directions at once. The first German soldiers fell almost immediately. Their shapes toppled between logs or collapsed at the base of trunks. Those behind them crouched low, expecting to locate the source of the attack. But the fog erased clarity. Muzzle flashes appeared as brief, unfixed sparks. The lines of bullets crossing the slope felt as though they originated from places that changed with each second. The grenadiers tried to establish a coherent picture, but found their senses offering contradictory information. The Volksgrenadiers' doctrine called for rapid adjustment, identify heavy weapons, locate rifle density, and choose between widening the assault or pushing straight through. But Carver's defense had stripped them of the stable references they needed for such decisions. When they tried to listen for the signature rhythm of machine gun fire, they heard bursts displaced by the fog. When they tried to trace the direction of rifle volleys, the echoes led them toward phantom positions. Carver watched from his cover, tracking the shift in the enemy's posture. The first shock was expected. The real question lay in whether the Germans would regroup quickly enough to regain momentum. He saw the hesitation as they tested the ground in front of them, expecting to see a clear line of defenders. Instead, they saw the fog, the layered shadows of trees and shapes that never clarified into a target. The fallen logs, which had threatened to slow the enemy in irregular ways, now served as confusing barriers that disguised firing angles. The machine gun teams halted their fire, slid their guns a few feet along their shallow trenches, and resumed shooting from new angles. The movements were small enough to go unseen, yet significant enough to make the soundscape shift. To the advancing soldiers, it suggested the presence of additional crews. Some thought the flank had become active. Others believed they were being fired on from a deeper layer of the slope. What had been 2 machine guns now suggested 4 or 6. Carver signaled the rifle tiers to change their timing. The first tier fired in a compact burst. The second tier followed a moment later. The third tier waited just long enough for the echoes from the first 2 to begin fading, then added its own precision fire. The sequence created the illusion of greater depth, multiple platoons arranged in deliberate spacing. The Germans could not know that the pattern had been arranged by a single mind, working within seconds of intuition. Some German soldiers attempted a rightward movement, angling toward what they thought might be the weaker side of the American line. They were met at once by fresh bursts from the displaced machine guns. Others tried to hug the left side, hoping to close the distance in a narrow channel, but rifle fire from the upper tier pressed them back. Every adjustment they attempted exposed them to fire from angles they could not predict. More disorienting than the bullets was the absence of visible structure. The Germans expected firing trenches, dugouts, or reinforced nodes of earth. They saw none of this. They saw glimpses of men among logs, the faint shadows of rifles, and the blur of motion swallowed by fog. A defense that had no clear outline became more threatening than one that did. Without borders or recognizable edges, the line seemed to expand each time they looked. A second wave of machine gun bursts hit the slope. Carver's teams shifted again, maintaining a pattern of movement too subtle to detect visually yet strong enough to distort the auditory map. The gunners remained disciplined, pausing between bursts to adjust their angle by inches. In the fog, these inches mattered. They produced ghost positions that did not exist, but seemed to. This was the moment Carver had anticipated. The enemy's push wavered. Not because their will faltered, but because the situation no longer provided a logic for advancing. The fog, the slope, and the broken rhythm of fire combined into an environment that dismantled every textbook expectation. Their officers attempted to rally them, but orders issued under uncertain terms carried less force. The grenadiers needed a definable objective to attack. They found only shifting sound and ground that refused to reveal meaning. The riflemen of Company Y felt the shift as well. They sensed the advantage, but held their positions, adhering to the rhythm Carver had set. No one surged forward. Their task was not to overwhelm, but to sustain a pressure precise enough to incline the enemy toward retreat. Carver watched the subtle collapse of the enemy's line through the fog. Once the hesitation settled, the withdrawal began, not in panic, but in the clipped movements of a tactical retreat. The grenadiers pulled back over the fallen trunks toward the undergrowth below, some pausing to check for wounded comrades, others glancing upward to understand what had struck them. They saw little. The ridge, half hidden by fog, revealed almost nothing of its defenders. Company I continued to fire in measured bursts, not to inflict additional harm, but to maintain the impression of depth and readiness. Only when the Germans had fully broken contact and slipped back into the lower ground did Carver give the signal to cease fire. The echoes faded quickly. What remained was the weight of cold air, the lingering smoke from the gunpowder, and the silence of a forest returning to stillness. The men stayed down, breathing slowly, waiting for the next sound that might suggest a renewed push. No such sound came. Carver moved along the tiers, noting every detail, the intact weapons, the unbroken snow around the positions, the absence of blood on the ground. He took in these facts not with triumph, but with a reserved clarity. The scene confirmed what he had hoped. The defense had held without cost. The 20 minutes had passed differently from how the order had presumed. The ridge did not feel like a place where a battle had ended. It felt like a field where pressure had briefly shaped the air into violence and then vanished, leaving behind only marks in the snow. The ridge gradually returned to a muted quiet, though the silence carried a faint echo of what had happened moments before. Snow fog drifted in slow swells, changing its density with each subtle shift of wind. Carver held the ceasefire long enough to ensure that no German element remained close enough to exploit a sudden pause. Only after the echoes dissolved completely did he signal the company to begin internal checks. No one cheered. No one rose carelessly from the ground. The men remained in their positions with the same discipline they had shown before the attack. Some breathed heavily, their arms trembling with the delayed weight of tension, but their movements were restrained. Carver's expectations had shaped more than the way they fought. They had shaped the way they waited. Medics moved through the tiers, checking each position with habitual precision. They had prepared themselves for the usual aftermath of a close fight. Shrapnel wounds, fallen riflemen, men bleeding into the snow. But as they crossed the slope, they found no casualties. Only 2 soldiers reported muscle cramps from holding prone positions too long. A handful of jackets bore small tears where fragments had grazed fabric without breaking skin. Otherwise, the ground held no signs of injury. The medics hesitated, checked again, and then exchanged looks of disbelief. For a winter engagement against a numerically superior force, the near-blank casualty log felt almost unreal. Carver examined the machine gun positions. Frost had shaken loose under recoil, exposing the cold metal beneath. The belts lay coiled and scattered where they had been thrown aside during reloading. He touched the frozen earth with a gloved hand and confirmed that the ground's firmness had not shifted. His men had fired from stable positions, preserving accuracy even under pressure. He recognized that the success had not come from raw firepower, but from timing, controlling the rhythm, not overwhelming with volume. The enemy had never perceived the line clearly enough to understand what they were facing. He did not articulate these reflections aloud. The outcome, though encouraging, remained subject to change. In winter, mountain fighting, an enemy who withdrew once could easily regroup and return with more force. The cloud cover thinned slightly in the early afternoon. The slope opened into longer sightlines. Carver used the opportunity to inspect the lower ground. The German tracks remained visible, some overlapping where men had moved in clusters, others stretching apart where the terrain had forced separation. None of the patterns suggested a renewed advance. The impressions had begun to harden in the dropping temperature. If the grenadiers returned soon, they would leave fresher, more pronounced marks along the same paths. At the tree line's edge, a liaison arrived with a message from regimental headquarters. It was a brief, impersonal note. Report enemy strength. Confirm company status. Expect continued pressure until rear area defenses were completed. There was no reference to the outcome on the ridge, no acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. The phrasing suggested an assumption of ongoing struggle rather than any decisive moment having passed. Carver absorbed the message and returned it. Rather than going straight back to the positions, he walked along the forward edge. The movement allowed him to reconsider the sequence of decisions that had unfolded. He replayed the terrain assessments, the placement of the tiers, the timing of the volleys. Nothing in the fight had depended on chance, yet nothing had been guaranteed. The defense had turned on an instinct he had carried long before the war, a refusal to accept that his men must be sacrificed to fulfill an order. His choices had not been designed to win a battle, but to prevent loss. As he moved, his boots left tidy impressions in the snow that contrasted with the ruptured marks in the fallen log zone. The difference resembled the distance between chaos and clarity. He sensed the narrowness of the line he had walked, how easily a shift in fog or a single premature shot might have altered everything. The realization brought no relief, only a deeper commitment to preserving what his company still held. When he returned to the positions, the men had begun distributing hot water and rations. Their movements were slow, almost automatic, as if their bodies were working through the residue of strain. The machine gunners cleaned their weapons in focused silence, their faces still bearing the fixed expressions of those who had not yet fully left the fight behind. There was no conversation. The absence of speech was not a void, but an adaptation. Silence was a way of letting the immediate past settle without breaking its shape. Before nightfall, a second liaison arrived with a clearer picture of the broader front. Other American formations were still withdrawing under intense pressure. Elsenborn Ridge had become one of the few positions where the line remained intact. Company I was ordered to hold until engineers completed their work behind the ridge. The tone was flat, acknowledging no particular difficulty or success. It had the sound of necessity rather than recognition. Carver nodded and continued his inspection. He knew that their position had not become safer simply because the initial attack had been repelled. A renewed push could come under cover of darkness, or at dawn, or after artillery pounded the slope. But he also sensed that the Germans were reassessing. The shape of their withdrawal had not been hurried enough to signal panic, nor confident enough to suggest they would test the ridge again without deliberation. Night drew in. The forest darkened in uneven layers, the fog thinning then returning in long stretches. Carver walked the line with measured steps, stopping at intervals to study the logs and the faint outlines of the terrain. The men, arranged in their tiers, remained alert. Their eyes followed each sound until the forest returned to quiet. Hours passed without contact. Then the distant mechanical hum, heard earlier, returned briefly, faded and vanished. It was impossible to say whether it came from vehicles repositioning or preparations for a new assault. But no soldiers appeared. No snow shifted where there should have been footsteps. Carver understood the meaning carried by absence. In war, silence could be as informative as movement. The enemy had not chosen the ridge for their next push. Their hesitation, built from the previous encounter, had redirected them elsewhere along the line. When dawn finally arrived, the light was pale and scattered. The inspections revealed only one truth. The enemy had not returned. The footprints from the previous day were still there, preserved under the renewed frost, but no fresh ones had been added. Later that morning, Division Headquarters authorized the relief of Company I. As the men began their withdrawal from the positions they had held, their steps carried a fatigue that felt dense and deliberate. No one expressed relief openly. Their bodies showed it only in the way their shoulders settled as they left the ridge behind them. Looking back, they saw the faint marks of their tears pressed into the snow. These imprints, shallow yet distinct, were the understated record of why they were still walking. At the regimental aid station, the casualty report from Company Y passed through several hands before anyone reacted to its numbers. The form listed no deaths, no critical injuries, and only minimal superficial harm. In the context of a winter engagement during a major German offensive, the figures looked misplaced, as if they belonged to a unit that had seen no action at all. Staff members rechecked the numbers, questioned the platoon leaders, and inspected equipment for signs of a heavier fight, but every verification returned the same improbable result. The document traveled upward with a tone of muted confusion, stripped of interpretation. The war's bureaucracy accepted data, not anomalies. Later in the afternoon, Carver was summoned to a coordination tent near the front. The interior smelled of damp canvas and stove smoke. Officers moved between tables, tracing shifting lines on a worn map. The questions directed at him were concise: an estimate of German strength, an outline of how the defense had been held. They were spoken not as commendation but as routine, the same questions any officer would face after a reportable engagement. Carver answered with the same restraint. He described the terrain, the fog, and the concentration of fire. He mentioned nothing about the structure of timing or the motive behind his decisions. Those elements did not fit into the template of the inquiry. The officers recorded his words and nodded. There was no follow-up, no speculation, no interpretation. They measured only the stability of the ridge and whether it could be held again. The mechanics of how it had been held were treated as an incidental detail, not the core of the event. When Carver stepped out of the tent, the evening light had already thinned into a dull grey. The ridge lay far behind him, reduced to a faint line against the horizon. The sound of the previous day's fire seemed contained somewhere within that line, as if the ridge still held the memory of it in compressed form. He understood that nothing he said in the tent could capture the precise interplay of terrain, fog, timing, and instinct that had shaped the fight. The event was already dissolving into abstraction as it entered the formal record. In the camp, soldiers sat by their gear, adjusting straps, replacing worn gloves, and performing the routine tasks that reassembled them after combat. Their movements carried a subdued exhaustion. Here and there, a man paused in his work, letting his hands rest, while his gaze drifted toward nothing specific. They did not speak of the fight. Silence felt like the only accurate form of acknowledgement. They understood that they had survived something fragile, something that could have broken if even a single element had shifted. They did not know the degree to which their survival had depended on Carver's refusal to accept the logic of expendability. They only knew that the order they received had promised 20 minutes at a forward line, and that the 20 minutes had ended with all of them accounted for. Night dropped across the camp, and the shadows lengthened around the tents. Carver walked to the perimeter, where the dark merged with the snowfield. He stood outside the reach of the lanterns, hands in his pockets, eyes on the faint line of the ridge. The cold pressed against him, carrying a stillness that seemed deeper than the night itself. He recognized the dissonance between what had been asked of him and what he had chosen to do. The order had been structured around delay, not preservation. Delay implied cost, and the system accepted that cost as natural. He had acted instead with a different premise, one derived not from doctrine, but from an earlier life, from a field where players were individuals he had known, trained, and protected. That old instinct had carried over into a place where it had no formal standing. He knew the system would not change because of what had happened on the ridge. War moved according to demands larger than any single company. Successes and failures alike were absorbed into broader maneuvers, but within that impersonal mechanism he had carved out a narrow space in which the outcome could shift. He had taken the order and bent its trajectory, not through defiance, but through interpretation. Snow began to drift again, thin at first, then thickening into a steady fall. Carver remained where he was, watching the flakes settle on the ground and on the faint tracks left by the company earlier in the day. The landscape softened, losing definition, as if the ridge itself were being slowly erased. The memory of the fight, too, seemed to recede into the blankness. When the snow lifted slightly, he returned to the camp. The men had already settled into their routines, some resting, others cleaning weapons or repairing equipment. They greeted him with nods, brief acknowledgments without ceremony. Their expressions carried a quiet steadiness, the steadiness of men who had survived not because fate had spared them, but because their part in the fight had been shaped with care. Carver walked between the rows of tents, feeling the weight of the moment in a way that did not translate into visible emotion. He knew that the ridge would remain only an entry in a ledger, one small line among thousands. It would not be marked as unusual. Its particular circumstances would fade behind the larger narrative of the Ardennes. But he also knew what the ledger could not record, that he had held the 20 minutes without surrendering a single man, that circumstances had aligned with intention, that he had preserved what he had vowed not to lose again. The snow deepened overnight. In the morning, when Company I prepared to move, only faint impressions of their earlier positions remained. The tiers on the ridge existed now only as shallow disruptions beneath the drift, visible if one looked closely but easily overlooked from a distance. As they marched, no one spoke of the fight. Conversation turned instead to immediate tasks, to equipment, to the next movement of the line. They left the ridge behind with no expectation that anyone else would understand what had transpired there. Understanding was not required. Survival was. From a rise near the edge of the camp, Carver stopped once more to look back. The ridge was distant again, obscured by the renewed snowfall. Nothing in its appearance revealed what had happened. There was no scar on the land, no ruined shape, no burned-out wreckage. Only a slope, indistinguishable from any other along the front. He turned and resumed walking. The war continued ahead, its demands unaltered. But the ground he had just left held a truth that would remain with him long after the battle lines shifted elsewhere. He had taken an order meant to extract a price and returned it without debt. He had chosen preservation over exchange. In the record, the entry for the fight would remain simple. Contact made, enemy strength estimated, no casualties. The numbers would speak with their usual neutrality, conveying outcome without essence. But the essence remained with him, that a company had been sent to delay an advance and had come back intact, that a task framed as unavoidable sacrifice had been met without loss, that for one brief interval in a winter war, a single officer's refusal to accept the familiar cost had altered the pattern without breaking the order itself. The ridge receded behind him. The snow kept falling. The war moved on.